Hey, good morning, friends. So glad that you're joining me again for another installment as we are looking at the book of Nehemiah. Already, just in the first chapter, we have seen the devastating news that Nehemiah has received about his homeland and the immediate response of Nehemiah, which is actually encouraging because the first response that he has is to seek God's face in prayer. If you haven't already taken a look at those first two devotions, I'd encourage you to do that as we've already now covered chapter 1. And now we're going to begin to look at chapter 2 today and on Monday. So in chapter 2, what we're going to see is a little bit of time has transpired, and now Nehemiah is going to have an opportunity to bring his request before the king. Some fascinating things that are happening here just in these first 8 verses of Nehemiah chapter 2. But let's first read those together before we start to dive into the text and really see all the nuance and the things that are unfolding here in this part of the book here. In Nehemiah chapter 2, verses 1 through 8, it says, "In the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was before him, I took up the wine and gave it to the king. Now I had not been sad in his presence. And the king said to me, 'Why is your face sad, seeing you are not sick? This is nothing but sadness of the heart.' Then I was very much afraid. I said to the king, 'Let the king live forever. Why should not my face be sad when the city, the place of my father's graves, lies in ruins, and its gates have been destroyed by fire?' Then the king said to me, 'What are you requesting?' So I prayed to the God of heaven. And I said to the king, 'If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, that you send me to Judah, to the city of my father's graves, that I may rebuild it.' And the king said to me," the queen sitting beside him, "How long will you be gone, and when will you return?" So it pleased the king to send me when I had given him a time. And I said to the king, "If it pleases the king, let the letters be given to me to the governors of the province beyond the river, that they may let me pass through until I come to Judah. And a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, that he may give me the timber to make the beams for the gates of the fortress of the temple, and for the wall of the city, and for the house that I shall occupy." And the king granted me what I asked, for the good hand of my God was upon me. Now, as we're starting to look at this text, like I said, there's just a lot of really amazing information here and things that are happening that you don't see right off the bat. But as we dive through the text, I hope you'll start to see how all of the details are coming together as we see what's happening in Nehemiah's life and the life of the people of these exiles of Israel as some begin to go back to Jerusalem in this new venture. In verse 1, in the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was before him, I took up the wine and gave it to the king. Now I had not been sad in his presence. Let's talk about that. So we talked previously about, the month Chislev there, that was about November, December for them. Now we're in the month of Nisan. So this is about 4 months later. This would have been about our March or April. So 4 months after the events of chapter 1, as I mentioned previously. Now that's significant for 2 reasons. First, I want you to understand is that it shows Nehemiah's fervency in prayer. So, as James says, the effectual, fervent prayer of a righteous man avails much. And as it avails much, we see this in action in Nehemiah's life. We see that Nehemiah is taking careful steps to seek God's face, to pour out his heart before him. As he hears all this devastating news from chapter 1, he doesn't have a breakdown. He doesn't just give this one-off prayer to God on behalf of a devastated Jerusalem. This went on for 4 months. The man fasted, he prayed, he was earnest in his petition before God. He was persistent in his prayer life. That's one of the first things that are important about this verse. But second, it's clear, as we're going to see later in the text, that this is a man who made preparations. If God was going to allow him to do this, he plans on being the very hands and feet of God in his own prayer. See, here's what I want us to pay attention to. This is not Nehemiah praying, "God, please send someone to go to Jerusalem." Or God, please bring some people along that will make this happen, this petition that's on my heart. God, I pray that you would just bring some people that would cause this to happen. Rather, it seems very clear that what Nehemiah is praying for is the same as how Isaiah responded in Isaiah chapter 6, verse 8, where he said, "Here am I, send me." God, this is my prayer. This is my petition before you. But more than that, listen, I want to be part of that. I want to be part of this prayer. Help me to do that. If it is pleasing to you, O Lord, this is what I want to do. And so, I think it's important that we pay attention also to the last phrase of verse 1 here. Nehemiah is pointing out to us that he has made it a point to not be sad in the king's presence. See, for 4 months, remember that, he has been lamenting and seeking the Lord in prayer over his homeland. He is burdened by this. It has been a weight on his shoulders. But he's also been taking extra precautions to not let it affect his demeanor before the king. However, as we start to see in verse 2, eventually it does begin to show. The king begins to notice. But here's something to think about in all this. The month of Nisan would have also been the time of the new year for the Persian Empire. And interestingly enough, it would have been also the time of New Year for the Jewish people. And just a few days after that celebration of New Year would have been Passover for the Jews. Now take that information and put it in light of Nehemiah's situation. He's in exile. He's before the king. He's heard this devastating news in chapter 1. He's been pouring out his heart to the Lord. And then he has this calendar reminder that things are still not the same. What do they have to celebrate for this new year? There's nothing they can do about Passover. So yet again, it's kind of another reminder to Nehemiah that things are not the way they should be. This is not home. This is not right in his eyes. The Jews had little to nothing to celebrate during this time. But as we pick up in verse 2, the king said to me, "Why is your face sad, seeing as you are not sick? This is nothing but sadness of the heart." Then I was very much afraid. We're going to pay careful attention to that phrase there in verse 2. But as we put ourselves in Nehemiah's shoes there for a moment, I want you to understand that this would have been a terrifying statement to hear. And here's the reason why. See, for many of these empirical rulers, they were constantly in a state of paranoia over whether there was going to be some kind of a plot to assassinate them or some kind of coup to take over their established kingdom. And so this resulted in people often being executed at the slightest fault or even the smallest suspicions. They often questioned the loyalty of their subordinates. Did they have ulterior motives? Were they truly serving the authority? Or were they secretly plotting against them in the background? Now, considering those things, the king notices Nehemiah's sadness of heart. Is it a ruse? Is it genuine? Is he trying to distract him from something else? And so, rather than Nehemiah showing relief, "Oh, wow, the king has noticed that I am sad," which is kind of the way I would have taken this at first. The king's noticed that my demeanor's not the same as it used to be. No. Nehemiah's response is, "Then I was very much afraid." I mean, after all, why shouldn't he be? The king could have invented a suspicion about Nehemiah's demeanor and had him killed right there on the spot. Kings did not like their subordinates to be gloomy in their presence. And what's even worse is the thing that he is sad about is the very thing that the king had declared to happen. Remember, Ezra has gone back to Jerusalem. They had attempted to begin to rebuild. And there's a decree that's issued in Ezra chapter 4, verses 11 through 16, where the privileges that Cyrus had given to the people to go back and rebuild had been completely stopped by Artaxerxes. And so now if Nehemiah opens his mouth about what's really bothering him, He's essentially going to be asking for the king to reconsider what would have no doubt been looked at as his already wise judgment and Nehemiah would be asking him to reverse that judgment as part of his request. So can you see why Nehemiah is scared here? I mean, he's standing before the powerful and an otherwise paranoid ruler of an empire. This is the same man, okay? This same man killed his older brother just so he could take the throne for himself. And then after that happens, he goes and executes the person who assassinated his father. So if he answers the king's question honestly, his request is going to be for the king to reverse what already seemed like a sound judgment being made on rebuilding Jerusalem. And worse than that, no king truly wants their enemies to ever have a chance at growing strong again and being who they once were before their defeat. I mean, he had already put a stop to this in Ezra 4. He had stopped the work in Jerusalem, and part of it was because he believed that they were acting as a rebellious people to the empire. So now Nehemiah is going to be asking the king for a chance to return to his people, to rebuild and to grow again. A strong Jerusalem would no doubt have been a threat to any of the neighboring states and cities and possibly the empire itself. And we're going to see that unfold in Tobias and Sanballat that comes later in chapter 2. So what king in their right mind would grant this kind of request that Nehemiah is about to articulate to the king, especially with this overtone of worry that someone was out to get them in the end? All of that, no doubt, is going through Nehemiah's head. What do I say now? I need to be honest with the king. I'm not so sure he's going to like what I have to say. And rather than just blurbing out exactly how he feels, he's actually very tactful in his response. Look at verse 3 here. I said to the king, let the king live forever. Why should not my face be sad when the city, the place of my father's graves, lies in ruins, and its gates have been destroyed by fire? Now listen, don't take this phrase as a throwaway. Let the king live forever. This isn't Nehemiah just going, God save the queen, and then he spouts off his request. This is Nehemiah showing his deepest reverence and respect for Artaxerxes. He really does have the king's best in mind. In his response here in verse 3, it's a show of this deep respect. But at the same time, he's pouring out his heart and his feelings about his homeland. He's sharing the true reason for his sadness. Now, rather than kind of putting Artaxerxes in defense mode, he really wins the king to his side. He gives this honest answer in verse 3. Let me read that again. Why should not my face be sad when the city, the place of my father's graves, it lies in ruin, and its gates have been destroyed by fire? Now, to borrow from James Montgomery Boyce, he writes it this way. He could have said this. Why am I sad? I'll tell you why I'm sad. 13 years ago, in the 7th year of your reign, a delegation of Jews went to Jerusalem with the Jewish scribe Ezra. Okay? Now, they tried to carry out the decree of your predecessor Cyrus to rebuild the temple and the walls. But as soon as the governors of Trans-Euphrates, they hear about it and they appeal to you, the work stops. You stopped it, and you didn't even wait to hear the other side of the story. You couldn't see that those governors over there by Jerusalem, they were just jealous of us. And they were afraid that a revitalized Jerusalem would be detrimental to their own personal interests. Now, as James Montgomery Boyce writes that, it kind of comes across as a response maybe you or I would give, right? I mean, we're speaking our mind in that moment. We're sharing our true feelings about how we feel about the situation. But notice that that's not how Nehemiah responds at all. In fact, he doesn't even make his response political. Rather, he actually makes his response personal. This is Nehemiah upset about his homeland. Not about the political malignment that has happened with the Persian Empire. Not about them being in charge and it not being Israel or someone else. He's not lamenting the reasons of power, but he's simply pouring out his personal desire and his hope for his own homeland. But finally, let me point out that he doesn't mention Jerusalem by name. And that may be some of the tact involved in his request. Some commentators say perhaps it was a way for Nehemiah to help the king to save face, since he had already made this decree in Ezra chapter 4, and to make the king look good in granting possibly this request. He doesn't mention Jerusalem by name. Rather, he says that it is the city, the place of my father's graves, that lies in ruin. And then later in verse 5, as we'll see, he calls it Judah. So by using these synonyms, no doubt the king knows what Nehemiah is talking about. But rather than directly say, I want to go back to Jerusalem and rebuild everything, that goes completely against that decree that you made earlier, which might actually make the king look bad in front of others, Nehemiah is very careful in his response. He's direct, he's passionate, but he's also careful. And so as we see in verse 4, then the king said to me, well, what are you requesting? So I prayed to the God of heaven. Now, it's interesting to see in this verse, somewhere in Nehemiah's explanation of his emotional state, there's this air of motivation in his voice that then prompts the king to ask the question in verse 4. Maybe it's perhaps the fact that the king is endeared to Nehemiah. He has a respect for Nehemiah. And he says, all right, so what do you want from me? What can I do to help you? And so maybe that catches Nehemiah off guard. There's got to be something in his voice as he's explaining his heart to the king that, as he implies, he's intending to do something about the state of Jerusalem if he's given the chance. And so maybe that catches him in an odd position. He didn't expect the king to respond to him that way. But the best part of the verse is, what does Nehemiah do? He's just been asked, okay, I see what you're saying, Nehemiah. So what do you want me to do about it? What do you want from me? And this is how Nehemiah responds, just like he did in chapter 1. He immediately goes to God in prayer. Friends, don't miss that. What you see here in verse 4 of chapter 2 is the same reaction of chapter 1 in verse 4. There is consistency in Nehemiah's life. When he doesn't know what to do, when he doesn't have the answer, when he's overwhelmed, when he needs sound wisdom and counsel, he turns to God. Again, prayer is a powerful tool at our disposal as followers of Christ. But yet, how sadly do we often neglect to use it? This is a sub-theme in this book, just like the aspect of leadership as a sub-theme here. Nehemiah's response to the king. Well, how do I respond? Well, first let me go to the King of Kings and seek his face first before I respond to this earthly king. It's just a beautiful picture. Before I respond to him, let me go to God. In verse 5, we see his response. And I said to the king, if it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, that you send me to Judah, to the city of my father's graves, that I may rebuild it. Now this goes back to what I said before about Nehemiah having a plan in place. He's not speaking off the top of his head in response to the king. He has had a plan in the back of his mind all along. Remember, he's had 4 months of seeking God's face and thinking through, okay, if the opportunity arises, what do I do? What do I say? How do I prepare for this journey that is so far away? What do I do when I get there and so forth? It's not just, oh, we're going to be in the moment and figure it out as we go. No. Nehemiah is very artful in how he prepares himself. And so as he responds to the king, he doesn't just off the cuff say, well, maybe we will fill in the blank. No, he knows the king wants a direct response. And he gives him a direct response. He unfolds this plan a little bit at a time, perhaps maybe to see where the limits are with the king. What kind of leash is he going to give him? How much latitude will he be allowed? And as a respected member of the king's court, how much favor am I going to have? Could be a little, could be a lot. He doesn't know. How much clout has he built up with this empirical ruler? And when Nehemiah responds, he is very direct and he's very specific about what he wants. I want to go back to the land of Judah. I want to go back to the city where my fathers are buried. I want to rebuild that city. And notice the response here in verses 6 through 8. And the king said to me, the queen sitting beside him, how long will you be gone and when will you return? So obviously there's some conversation that takes place between this and the end of verse 6, because now it says, so it pleased the king to send me when I had given him a time. And I said to the king, if it pleases the king, let letters be given to me to the governors of the province beyond the river. Perhaps beyond and river are capitalized in your translation, meaning it's a specific location near the land of Judah, that they may let me pass through until I come to Judah. And a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, that he may give me timber to make beams for the gates of the fortress of the temple, and for the wall of the city, and for the house that I shall occupy. Now, it's interesting here that we mention, or that it is mentioned, the queen is present in verse 6. We're not completely sure why, although there are a couple of good theories. One theory suggests that the queen and the king were both fond of Nehemiah, and they both listened as he gave his requests. But what might be a more plausible theory is that the king and queen are banqueting, perhaps, as we pointed out earlier, as they celebrate the new year in the Persian Empire. This would be a reason why the king and queen would both be together when Nehemiah makes his request. And so as these first few verses have transpired in verses 1 through 5, now perhaps there is this moment where Nehemiah is serving the king and queen privately after this New Year celebration has taken place, and he's able to have this conversation. But more importantly, I want you to notice what's just happened in these 4 verses. Nehemiah has given Artaxerxes a specific time frame for his journey and for the rebuilding of Jerusalem. He knows that he needs authorization not only for his travel as he passes through these other lands. He wants to prevent himself from being a victim of theft, from being a victim of violence and harm. He wants them to know as he's passing through, I have the king's authority to be here. So even better, he knows exactly what he needs. I need these letters. I need authorization from the king to make my journey back to Jerusalem. On top of that, I also know the kind of materials that I'm going to need as I'm going to rebuild these walls. I'm going to rebuild this temple, and I'm also going to rebuild a house for myself. See, these are not off-the-cuff requests. This man has spent countless hours coming up with a detailed plan so that when the time arrives, like now, he can give an educated, articulated plan to the king to see him grant his request. Leaders like specifics. Okay, I want to do this. Well, how? Why? When? And Nehemiah gives all of that to Artaxerxes. And as the verse says, the plan must have been impressive because as we're going to see in our next installment, as he begins to make his journey in verses 10 and 11, that the king not only grants his request, but he actually sends Nehemiah out with more than he asked for. And in the last part of verse 8, notice what it says here. And the king granted me what I asked, for the good hand of my God was upon me. I think that's the best part of what we read here in these first 8 verses of chapter 2. Yes, it's wonderful that the king granted Nehemiah's request. Yes, it's wonderful that his plan came to fruition. And now he's going to be able to embark on this journey of some 1,500 miles back to Jerusalem. But the best part is this last phrase here in verse 8. Who gets the credit for all this? It's God. Yes, Nehemiah says, the king granted my request, but only because the hand of the Lord was upon me. When it came down to who got the glory, it all went to God. Nehemiah prayed. He carefully planned this event, but he still gave all the glory to God. He may have thanked the king repeatedly for granting this request, but he knew that the request was only granted because God allowed it to happen from his gracious hand. And so what we're going to see later in this book is that not only did Artaxerxes grant the request, as I said a moment ago, but he's going to go above and beyond. He's going to assign soldiers and military officers to accompany him on his journey. And Nehemiah is going to embrace this and say, this is just another manifestation that God's hand is directly involved in the work that I'm setting out to do. And no doubt this would have been incredibly impressive as he's walking through these towns and nations with these letters of authority from the king and a representation from his army. To quote Paul in Ephesians chapter 3, verse 20, it says, "Now to him who is able to do far more abundantly than what we ask or think, according to the power at work within us, to him be glory in the church and in Christ Jesus throughout all generations, forever and ever. Amen." What's happening in Nehemiah's life is a tangible illustration of Paul's words here in Ephesians 3, that God can and will do these kinds of things. But let me close with some takeaways for us this morning, just by asking us some introspective questions. Are we willing to be the hands and feet of Jesus as part of the answer to our prayers? Do we say, God, send me? Let me be part of this, if you would allow? Or do we simply say, Lord, help this situation. Lord, bring the right people to do such and such. Lord, I hope that you answer this prayer by bringing whoever into the picture. Or do we say, God, can I be a part? Would you allow me to be a part of this request that I am making? Do we respond in prayer when a decision comes before us? That's my next question for us. Do we respond in prayer when a decision comes before us, or do we try to take matters into our own hands, to live by our own worldly wisdom? A third question, do we give God all the glory when a plan comes to fruition? Or do we try to bask in the limelight? Do we try to take all the credit? Or do we give credit to other human agents without acknowledging that everything, as James says, comes from the gracious and good hand of our Redeemer and Lord? James says every good and perfect gift comes from above. Friends, these are some things to think about as we're looking at the life of Nehemiah and the story that unfolds in this book. So I hope you'll meditate on these things before we join back together and find Nehemiah now arriving in Jerusalem. And we'll do that during our study together next time.